The Masked Rider of Rohan. In the days when Theoden king held sway over the Mark, when the golden halls of Edoras rang with the laughter of his people, and the Rohirrim rode proud upon the plains, there came a darkness that crept not from Mordor nor Isengard, but from the very heart of Rohan itself. It was in the month of Retha, when the snows had melted from the misty mountains, and the grass grew green upon the Riddermark, that the first of the troubles began. Riders sent forth from Edoras to patrol the eastern borders failed to return, their horses found wandering riderless near the Entwash. The bodies of these faithful servants of the Mark were discovered days later, bearing wounds that no orc blade had made, nor wolf's fang, but something far more terrible. Hama, doorward of the Golden Hall, brought word to King Theoden as the sun set crimson behind the White Mountain. "My lord," said he, his weathered face grave beneath his helm, "the riders bear marks of fire upon their flesh, yet no flame touched them. Their weapons lie undrawn, as if they faced no earthly foe." The king's face darkened, and Grima Wormtongue, who stood ever at his right hand in those days, whispered soft words of counsel. "Perhaps, my lord, it were wise to call the riders back from the borders. Why risk more good men to whatever evil stalks the Eastfold?" But Eomer, nephew to the king and third marshal of the Mark, stepped forward with wrath kindling in his eyes. "Uncle, we cannot cower within our halls while darkness devours our people. Let me ride forth with the Eord, and we shall hunt down this shadow that dares prey upon the horse lords." Yet ere the king could answer, there came a sound upon the wind, the thunder of hoofbeats approaching Edoras at great speed. A lone rider approached the gates, clad in black mail with a helm that covered his face entirely, wrought in the likeness of a horse's head, but bearing no mark of rank or house. His steed was a great gray stallion, fleet as the wind yet bearing signs of a hard ride from far countries. The stranger drew rein before the guards at the gate and spoke in a voice muffled by his helm. "I seek audience with Theoden king, son of Thengel. I bring tidings of the evil that stalks his borders, and offer my sword in service to the Mark." When the doorward demanded his name and lineage, the rider answered thus, "I am called the Rider of the Grey Dawn, and I have come from far lands where similar darkness has fallen. More than this I may not say until I stand before the king himself." Word of the stranger's arrival reached the Golden Hall. Ere the last light faded from the western sky, King Theoden sat upon his throne, carved from a single mighty tree of the Fangorn, while his counselors gathered about him in the lamplight. The air was thick with unease, for the tales of the slain riders had spread through Edoras like wildfire, and fear walked the streets, where once only joy had dwelt. When the masked rider was brought before the throne, he walked with the proud bearing of one born to the saddle. Yet there was something strange in his gait, a careful precision, as if he bore wounds that pained him still. His black cloak was travel-stained and bore tears that spoke of many battles, yet his mail shone as if newly forged. "Approach, stranger," commanded the king, his voice echoing in the great hall. "You claim knowledge of the evil that besets my realm. Speak then, and let us hear what wisdom you bring from distant land." The masked rider stepped forward and inclined his head with proper courtesy. "My lord king, I have walked in shadow for many years, hunting those who serve the dark powers in ways both ancient and terrible. The deaths upon your borders bear the mark of one I have pursued across many leagues, a servant of the enemy who wields fire without flame, who kills with a touch that burns the soul itself." Grima Wormtongue slithered forward, his pale eyes glittering in the firelight. Strange words from one who will not show his face. How are we to trust such tales, my lord? Perhaps this stranger brings not aid, but further danger to our people. But Eomer studied the rider closely, noting the worn hilt of his sword and the manner in which he bore himself. "You speak of pursuit, friend. How long have you hunted this shadow?" 7 years have passed since first I took up this chase," the rider replied, It began in the southern reaches of Gondor, where villages burned with cold fire and children wept tears of ash. I followed its trail through the paths of the dead, across the fields of Lebanon, and north through the gap of Rohan. Always it fled before me, leaving death in its wake. The king leaned forward upon his throne. "And you believe you can defeat this creature where others have failed?" "I do not know, my lord, but I know its nature and its weaknesses, and I have wounds to prove the truth of my word." The rider placed his hand upon his breast, where beneath the mail a strange mark could be glimpsed, a burn in the shape of a hand that glowed faintly with its own light. This mark it gave me in our first encounter, and by this mark I can sense its presence. Even now it draws near to Edoras, though it moves by hidden paths. A silence fell upon the hall, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of wind across the plains. Then Theoden spoke. "If you speak truly, then you are welcome in Rohan. But know this, I will not have my people used as bait in any hunter's trap. If you would serve the mark, you must submit to our laws and customs." The rider bowed deeply. "I ask only for a horse and leave to ride the borders, my lord. I work best alone, and this evil thing flees from open battle. But I swear by the honor of my house, though I may not name it, that I shall not rest until this shadow is driven from your lands, or I myself lie dead upon the field." 3 days passed, and the masked rider took his place among the border patrols, though he rode always apart from the others, keeping watch in the wild places where few dared venture. The men of Rohan whispered of him around their fires, some naming him a friend, and others wondering if he might not be some agent of the enemy himself, sent to spy upon their movement. Eomer alone among the great lords gave the stranger his trust, for he had looked into the rider's eyes through the slits of his helm, and seen there a pain that spoke of long suffering in the service of others. "There is something in him that reminds me of our own lost ones," he said to Eowyn, his sister, as they stood upon the walls of Edoras, watching the rider depart upon his gray stallion. "Some grief that gnaws at him like a wolf at a bone, and yet he will not show his face or speak his name," replied Eowyn, her golden hair streaming in the wind. "What manner of man hides himself so completely from those he claims to serve? Perhaps one who has lost the right to be called by his true name," Eomer mused. "War leaves many scars, sister, and not all of them can be seen by the light of day." Meanwhile, in the eastern reaches of the Riddermark, the masked rider pursued his quarry through vale and fold, following signs that would have been invisible to any other hunter. Scorched earth where no fire had burned, withered grass in patterns that hurt the eye to look upon, and always the lingering scent of sulfur and decay that marked the passage of the shadow. On the 4th night, as he made camp in a grove of ash trees near the snow-born river, his pursuit bore fruit. The mark upon his breast began to burn with cold fire, and his horse whinnied in terror as something approached through the darkness, something that walked upright like a man, but cast no shadow in the moonlight. The thing that emerged from the night was indeed shaped like a man, but stretched and twisted, as if its flesh had been pulled like clay by cruel hand. Its skin was the color of old parchment, and where its eyes should have been, 2 points of red flame burned with malevolent intelligence. It wore no armor and carried no weapon, for its touch was death itself. "So," it spoke in a voice like wind through dead leaves, "the hunter has found his prey at last. 7 years you have followed me, bearer of the mark. Did you think I did not know? Did you think I fled from fear?" The masked rider rose slowly, his hand upon his sword hilt. "I thought you fled because you are a coward, creature of shadow. You prey upon the innocent and the defenseless, but when faced with one who knows your nature, you slink away like a beaten cur." The creature laughed, a sound that made the very trees shudder. "Bold words from one who hides behind steel and leather. But I know what you are, fallen prince. I know the shame that drives you to cover your face and forsake your name. Shall I tell these simple horsefolk what manner of man leads them into danger?" For a moment, The rider's hand trembled upon his blade, and the creature pressed its advantage. Yes, I can taste your fear, the fear of recognition, of judgment, of the truth that festers in your heart like poison. You think to win redemption through this endless hunt, but there is no redemption for what you have done. Perhaps not, the rider replied, drawing his sword with a ring of steel, but there is justice, and that shall suffice. The battle that followed was unlike any that had been fought upon the plains of Rohan since the days of Yorl the Young. The shadow creature moved with unnatural speed, its touch leaving trails of cold fire wherever it passed, while the masked rider fought with the skill of one who had learned swordplay in the highest halls of Gondor and refined it through years of desperate battle. Steel rang against claw as they circled each other in the moonlight, neither giving ground. The creature's burning eyes left tracers in the darkness, and where its feet touched the earth, the grass withered and died. But the rider's blade had been blessed by the wizards of old, and when it struck the creature's flesh, it blazed with silver light that made the monster scream in voices that were not wholly its own. You cannot destroy me, the creature hissed as they broke apart. Ichor dripping from a dozen wounds. I am beyond death, beyond the reach of mortal weapons. I am the echo of ancient sins, the price of broken oaths. Then let me pay that price, the rider answered, raising his sword high. The mark upon his breast blazed like a star, and for a moment the pain of it nearly drove him to his knees. But he mastered himself and spoke words in the high tongue of Numenor, words of binding and command that had not been heard in Middle-earth for many ages. The creature shrieked and writhed as invisible chains seemed to wrap about its form. No, you have not the right. You are Oathbreaker, Kinslayer, abandoned of the valor. I am all of these things, the rider said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow, but I am also their scourge and their hunter. By the light of Arundel and the power of the ring-bearers, I bind you to the fate you have earned. With a final thrust, he drove his blade deep into the creature's heart. Light exploded from the wound, and the shadow thing dissolved into mist and memory, leaving only the scent of rain-washed stone and the distant sound of the sea. The masked rider fell to his knees, spent by the effort, as hoofbeats thundered across the plain. Omer and a company of his riders had seen the light from afar and ridden hard to reach the battle site. They found the stranger kneeling beside the snowborn, his sword planted in the earth before him like a cross. Is it done? Eomer asked, dismounting and approaching carefully. It is done, the rider replied. The shadow is lifted from your borders. Your people may ride in peace again. But as Eomer helped the stranger to his feet, he noticed that the man's cloak had been torn in the battle, revealing beneath it not the black mail he had worn, but a hauberk of white steel marked with the tree and 7 stars of Gondor, and upon his breast a jewel that caught the moonlight and held it like captive fire. Friend, Eomer said slowly, I think there is more to your tale than you have told us. The masked rider pulled his cloak close about him once more. There is always more to every tale, Marshal of the Mark, but some chapters are best left unread. Word of the stranger's victory spread swiftly through Rohan, carried by the swift horses of the Eord to every corner of the Mark. In mead halls and stables, around forges and hearth fires, the folk spoke in wonder of the masked rider who had slain the shadow that stalked their borders. Yet, with wonder came questions, and with questions came doubt. In the Golden Hall, King Theoden held council with his lords and thanes. The stranger had returned to Edoras with Eomer's company, but he kept to the guest chambers and spoke little, claiming weariness from his battle. Grima Wormtongue, ever ready with poisoned counsel, whispered suspicions into any ear that would hear them. My lord, said he to the king as they walked upon the battlements, does it not seem strange that this rider will not remove his helm even in the sacred halls of your fathers? What manner of guest shows such discourtesy to his host? He has done us great service, Theoden replied, but there was trouble in his voice. The evil that threatened our people is no more, so he claims Grima continued, his pale eyes glittering. But who can say what other evils he might bring? I have heard whispers from the men who rode with Marshal Eomer, whispers of white steel beneath black cloth, of jewels that shine with their own light. These are not the possessions of a simple wandering knight. Meanwhile, in the guest chamber, the masked rider sat alone by the window, gazing out upon the green plains that stretched away toward the misty mountain. His helm lay upon the table beside him, but his face remained turned from the light, hidden in shadow. Upon his breast, the mark left by the shadow creature had faded to a thin white line, but the deeper wound, the one that had driven him to take up this lonely hunt, remained as fresh as ever. A soft knock came at his door, and Éowyn entered bearing a tray of food and wine. She set it upon the table and stood for a moment, studying the stranger with eyes as keen as her brother's blade. "You do not eat," she observed, "nor do you remove your helm, even in private. Are you perhaps not as mortal as you seem?" The rider turned slightly, though his face remained hidden. "I am mortal enough, Lady of Rohan, more mortal than most, perhaps, for I carry the weight of mortal failing. My brother told me of the armor you wear beneath your cloak," Éowyn said quietly. "The tree and stars of Gondor are not unknown in Rohan. We have fought beside the men of the South Kingdom many times, and I know the marks of their nobility when I see them." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of wind in the eve. Finally, the rider spoke. "What would you have me say, lady? That I am some lost prince of Gondor, wandering the world in search of redemption? Such tales are told in children's stories, not in the harsh light of truth." "I would have you say nothing but the truth," Éowyn replied, "for I think you carry a burden too heavy for one man to bear alone, and pride serves no purpose when the weight grows too great." The rider's shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment the pain he carried seemed to fill the very air of the chamber. "The truth, lady? The truth is that some names are better forgotten, some deeds better left unspoken. I am the masked rider, and that name serves well enough for what I have become." But Éowyn was not so easily turned aside. "And what of what you were? What of the man who learned to bear such noble arm, who speaks the high tongue of Numenor, and wields a blade blessed by wizards? That man had a name once, and a place in the world. That man is dead," the rider said with finality. "He died 7 years ago, in fire and shadow and the breaking of all oaths. What walks in his place is merely the echo of his sins, hunting the darkness he helped to create." As the spring turned to summer upon the plains of Rohan, riders came from the south, bearing the white banner of Gondor, and summons for all loyal lords to attend upon the steward in Minas Tirith. War was brewing in the east, they said, and all the free peoples must stand together against the growing shadow. King Theoden received the messengers in his hall with all due honor, but his heart was troubled. The masked rider had remained in Edoras through the long weeks since his victory, keeping to himself and speaking little. Yet his presence had become a weight upon the king's mind. There were whispers among the people. Some called him savior. Others questioned what manner of man would not show his face to those he served. When the Gondorian herald had delivered his message and been given chambers for the night, Theoden called his council to consider their response. The great lords of Rohan gathered in the hall, Erkenbrand of Westfold, Elfhelm of the Eastmark, and others whose names were written in the books of honor. Ymir stood at the king's right hand, while Éowyn took her place among the advisors, as was her right as daughter of the house. "The steward calls for aid," Theoden said, his voice carrying the weight of years and kingship. "What say you, my lord? Shall Rohan ride to the aid of Gondor, as our fathers did in days of old?" One by one, the lords spoke their counsel. Some urged caution, saying that Rohan's strength should be kept for the defense of their own borders. Others spoke for honor and alliance, reminding all of the ancient friendship between the Mark and the White City. But as they debated, a new voice spoke from the shadows near the great doors. "My lords," said the masked rider, stepping forward into the light, "if I may speak, I would offer counsel in this matter." Grima Wormtongue hissed like a serpent. "What right has this nameless wanderer to speak?" in the councils of kings. Let him keep to his place and leave policy to those born to rule." But Theoden raised a hand for silence. "He has earned the right through service to the mark. Speak, rider. What wisdom do you offer?" The masked figure stood straight and tall, his dark cloak flowing about him like the wings of some great bird. "My king, I have walked in the southern lands and seen the signs of war gathering. The enemy moves openly now, no longer content with shadows and whispers. If Gondor falls, Rohan cannot stand alone against what is coming. And yet," interjected Erkenbrand, "if we send our strength south and leave our own borders undefended, we may find our halls burned when we return, if we return at all." "True words," the rider acknowledged. "But consider this. The alliance between Rohan and Gondor has stood for centuries because each has aided the other in the hour of greatest need. Break that bond now, and you will face the darkness alone when your own hour comes." Eomer stepped forward, his hand upon his sword hilt. "You speak as one who knows both realms well, friend. Have you ridden the streets of Minas Tirith? Have you stood upon the walls of the White City?" A moment of silence stretched like a bowstring, and in that silence, those who watched closely saw the rider's hand tremble upon his cloak. "I have," he said quietly, "long ago, when the world was younger and hope burned brighter in the hearts of men." "Then tell us," pressed Éowyn, her voice sharp as a blade, "what manner of welcome would a rider of Rohan receive in the White City? What honors would be shown to the Mark's representative?" The rider was quiet for so long that some began to shift restlessly, thinking he would not answer. When he spoke at last, his voice was heavy with old grief. "The steward of Gondor is a man of honor, and Rohan's riders would be welcomed with all ceremony due to ancient allies." But he paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "But there are those in the White City who have long memories, who remember old grievances and count old debts. A man might find enemies where once he had friends, and sorrow where once he knew joy." King Theoden studied the stranger with eyes grown wise through many years of rule. "You speak as one who has reason to fear recognition, rider. What have you left undone in Gondor that troubles you so?" "Nothing undone, my lord," the rider replied. "Rather, I fear what I have already done." Despite the masked rider's veiled warnings, King Theoden chose honor over caution. Within a fortnight, the banners of Rohan were flying on the wind as a great host assembled upon the plains before Edoras. 6,000 spears would ride south to answer Gondor's call, led by the king himself despite his years, with Éomer commanding the van and the flower of the Mark's cavalry. The masked rider had asked leave to accompany the host, claiming his knowledge of southern roads might prove useful. Some of the lords muttered against allowing a nameless stranger to ride with them to war, but Éomer spoke for him, and the king's word was final. Yet as they prepared to depart, Theoden called the rider to him privately. "I will not command you to reveal yourself," the old king said, as they stood in his chambers, the morning light streaming through the windows. "But I sense that this journey will bring you face to face with whatever past you flee. Are you prepared for that?" The rider stood silent for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. "No man is ever prepared to face his failures, my lord, but sometimes the wheel of fate turns full circle, and what has been broken must be made whole, or broken utterly." "Wise word," Theoden mused. "Yet I wonder, if you are recognized in Gondor, will it bring shame upon Rohan for harboring you?" "I pray not, my lord, but if it does, I swear to you that I will take whatever consequences come upon myself alone. The Mark has shown me kindness when I had no claim to it, and I would not see that repaid with dishonor." 3 days they rode south through the green lands of Rohan, past the ancient burial mounds of the kings, and across the broad waters of the Entwash. The masked rider kept to the rear of the column, speaking little and avoiding the campfires where the other riders gathered to sing the old songs of their people. But Éowyn, who rode with the host in her role as keeper of the people's spirits, often found her eyes drawn to the solitary figure. On the 4th night, as they camped in the shadow of the White Mountains, with Gondor's borders only a day's ride ahead, she approached him, where he sat apart from the others, tending to his gray horse with careful attention. "Tomorrow we cross into the realm of the steward," she said, settling herself upon a fallen log nearby. "You grow more troubled with each mile southward. What awaits you in the White City that you fear so greatly?" The rider's hands stilled upon his horse's mane. "Judgment, lady, the judgment I have fled from for 7 long years." "And what crime requires such long exile?" Éowyn pressed. "Murder? Treason? Cowardice in battle? All of these things," the rider said quietly. "And worse, besides." Éowyn frowned, studying his cloaked and helmeted figure. "I find that hard to believe. I have watched you these past months, seen how you carry yourself, how you speak to others. Whatever you may have done, I see no cruelty in you, no cowardice. You rode alone into darkness to save people who were strangers to you. That is not the action of a man without honor." "Honor?" The rider laughed bitterly. "Lady, you know not what you speak of. I was raised to know honor as other men know breath, as necessary to life itself. Yet when the test came, when everything I held dear hung in the balance, I chose the easy path, the safe path. I chose to save myself, while others died for my failures. Then why do you not return to face whatever consequences await? Why hide behind steel and silence?" The rider was quiet for so long that Éowyn thought he would not answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I am afraid, lady. Afraid that if I remove this helm, if I speak my true name, I will remember too clearly what I have lost. And I fear that pain more than I fear death itself." The towers of Minas Tirith rose before them, like a vision from the elder days, white stone gleaming in the morning sun, as the host of Rohan approached the great gates. The Pelennor fields stretched green and fair around the city, dotted with the camps of other allies who had answered the steward's call. Banners flew from every tower, the tree and stars of Gondor, the swan of Dol Amroth, the green standards of Lossarnach, and many others. King Theoden rode at the head of his column, resplendent in his golden armor with the great horn Guthwine at his side. Behind him came the flower of Rohan's nobility, their mail bright and their spears proud. Yet among all that martial splendor, one figure seemed to shrink from the light, the masked rider who had drawn his cloak close about him and rode with his head bowed as if the very sight of the White City caused him pain. At the gates, they were met by a company of the guard in their tall helms and silver mail, led by a stern-faced captain whose eyes held the wisdom of many campaigns. "Hail and welcome, Theoden King," he called out. "Long has Gondor hoped for this day. I am Beregond, captain of the guard, and I am commanded to escort you to the steward with all honor." As the procession wound its way up through the 7 circles of the city, the masked rider kept his place in the rear ranks, his gray horse moving quietly among the other mounts. Yet there were those among the guard who cast curious glances at him, for there was something in his bearing that spoke of familiarity with these streets, these towers, these ancient stone. In the citadel, they were received in the great hall where the stewards had ruled for long ages in the name of the absent king. Denethor sat upon the high seat, a man grown grim with years and the weight of his office, his dark eyes holding shadows that spoke of secret sorrow. At his right hand stood his elder son Boromir, a warrior in his prime, whose strength and courage were already legend throughout Gondor. "Welcome, Theoden King," Denethor said, rising from his seat. "Gondor is glad of your coming in this dark hour. The shadow grows strong in the east, and all free peoples must stand together if we are to see another dawn." The ceremonies of greeting were long and formal, as befitted the meeting of 2 great realms. Yet, as the lords of Rohan were presented one by one, the masked rider remained in the shadows near the great doors, hoping to pass unnoticed among the crowd of lesser knights and retainers. But Boromir's eyes were keen, trained by years of war to notice anything out of place. As the formal presentations concluded, and the assembled lords began to disperse for the feast that would follow, he approached the masked figure with measured steps. "You there!" he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. "I know every knight of Rohan by reputation, if not by sight, yet your face is hidden and your name unspoken. What manner of warrior hides himself so in the halls of his allies? The rider turned slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his cloak. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, but those who knew how to listen could hear the pain that lay beneath the word. I am but a simple knight in service to King Theoden, my lord. My name is of no account. Boromir stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the stranger. Your bearing speaks otherwise, friend. You carry yourself like one born to command, and your arms, though hidden, seem to be of Gondorian make. Have we met before? I think not, my lord, the rider replied, but his voice had grown hoarse with strain. I am sure you would remember such a meeting. For a moment, the two men stood facing each other in tense silence. Then Boromir's expression changed, his eyes widening as if he had seen a ghost. Your voice, he whispered. By the valor, I know that voice. The masked rider took a step backward, his hand moving instinctively to his sword hilt. You are mistaken, my lord. I am no one. You would know. But Boromir was already reaching out, his strong hands grasping the rider's shoulder. Remove your helm, he commanded, his voice shaking with sudden emotion. Remove it now, and let me see if my eyes deceive me. Please, the rider whispered, do not ask this of me. I do not ask, Boromir said firmly. I command it, by the authority of my house and the love I bore to one I thought was dead. With shaking hands, the masked rider reached up and slowly lifted the helm from his head. The helm fell from nerveless fingers to ring upon the marble floor of the great hall, and in the sudden silence that followed, a gasp echoed through the assembled company. For the face revealed beneath was noble and fair, marked by years of sorrow and hardship, but unmistakable to those who had known him in his youth. Dark hair streaked with premature silver, gray eyes that held depths of pain, and features that bore the stamp of Númenórean blood, the blood of the kings of Gondor. Faramir, Boromir breathed, his voice breaking upon the name. My brother, you live. The man who had called himself the Masked Rider stood trembling before the assembled lords, his secret finally exposed. Boromir, he whispered, and in that single word was contained 7 years of exile and grief. I should not have come here. I should have turned away. But Boromir would hear none of it. With a cry that echoed through the hall, he swept his younger brother into an embrace that spoke of years of mourning ended, of prayers answered beyond hope. Around them, the assembly watched in wonder and confusion as the captain of Gondor wept openly for joy. We thought you dead, Boromir said, holding his brother at arm's length to look upon his face. The funeral ships, the mourning bells, the empty tomb in the houses of the dead. Father has grieved these 7 years for his lost son. Faramir's face was pale as parchment, his eyes darting toward the high seat where Denethor still sat, frozen in shock. I am dead, he said quietly. The man you knew, the son you remember, he died in the fire and ruin of Osgiliath 7 years past. What stands before you is only a shadow, a remnant driven by guilt and the need for redemption. What madness is this? Boromir demanded. You stand here whole and hale, if marked by hardship. What fire? What ruin? Osgiliath stands strong, its bridges guarded, its walls intact. A bitter laugh escaped Faramir's lips. Does it? Then the fires burned only in my dreams, and the dead walk only in my nightmares. He looked around the hall at the watching faces, seeing confusion, recognition, and in some eyes, the dawning of terrible understanding. From the high seat came the sound of footsteps, measured and heavy. Denethor descended the steps slowly, his face a mask of control that barely concealed the turmoil beneath. When he reached the center of the hall, he stopped a few paces from his son, studying him as if he were some vision that might vanish at a touch. Faramir, he said at last, his voice devoid of warmth. My son, 7 years I have mourned you. 7 years I have borne the weight of your loss, and now you stand before me, alive and well, having let me suffer this grief while you played at being a wandering knight. Explain yourself. The words struck Faramir like physical blows, and he swayed upon his feet. Father, the things I have done, the failures I bear, I could not face the shame of them. I thought it better to let the dead lie undisturbed than to bring dishonor upon our house. Dishonor? Denethor's voice rose, and for the first time, emotion cracked through his controlled facade. You speak of dishonor? What dishonor could match the cruelty of letting your father believe his son was dead? What shame could justify such deception? King Theoden, who had watched this reunion with growing understanding, stepped forward. My lords, he said quietly, perhaps this matter were better discussed in private. The hall has many ears, and family griefs should not be aired before strangers. But Denethor's eyes blazed with a cold fire. No, he said. Let all hear what manner of son I have raised. Let all know how the younger son of the steward repays the love and trust of his house. Faramir closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they held the look of a man who had accepted his doom. You want the truth, father? Then hear it, and judge whether I was right to stay dead in your memory. 7 years ago, Faramir began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I commanded the defenses of Osgiliath when the enemy launched a surprise assault across the Anduin. 3,000 men held the bridges against 10 times their number, waiting for reinforcements that never came. The hall was silent as death, every ear straining to catch his word. Even the servants had stopped in their duties to listen to this tale that none had heard before. For 3 days we held them, Faramir continued, 3 days of hell upon the ancient stones, while our numbers dwindled and our hope faded. On the 4th day, a host of Southrons appeared upon the eastern bank, corsairs with fire ships, Haradrim with Mumakil, and at their head a Nazgul riding upon a fell beast. Boromir stepped forward, his face pale with shock, but the reports said only of a minor skirmish, some border raiders driven back with small loss. Father, you told me. I told you what needed to be told. Denethor interrupted harshly. The truth serves no purpose save to spread panic and despair. Faramir laughed bitterly. The truth, father, is that your younger son proved himself a coward when the test came. When the Nazgul Lord offered terms, safe passage for my men, in exchange for the surrender of the bridges, I was tempted. 3,000 lives balanced against the strategic value of some old stone. What would you have done? I would have held, Boromir said immediately. Held until death, as our oaths demanded. Yes, Faramir nodded. As I should have done, as I intended to do. But then, his voice broke, and he was silent for a long moment. Then I saw the faces of my men. Boys, most of them. Some no older than 15. They looked to me for salvation, and I wanted to give it to them. The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn too tight. Finally, Éowyn spoke from among the Rohirrim. What happened, Faramir? What choice did you make? I made the only choice I could live with, he replied. I rejected the Nazgul's terms and called for the final charge. We broke their first assault and drove them back to the eastern shore, but at terrible cost. Of the 3,000 men who followed me to Osgiliath, barely 300 survived to see the reinforcements arrive at dawn. Denethor's face had grown gray as ashes. You held the bridges. You drove back the enemy. Where is the cowardice in this? Where is the shame that drove you feign death? Faramir's laugh was hollow as a tomb. Shame, father, lies in what came after. As I lay among the wounded, listening to the death cries of boys who had trusted me to lead them safely home, the Nazgul Lord spoke to me in my mind. It showed me visions of what might have been, my men alive and whole, returning to their families, their sweethearts, their children yet unborn. It offered me that reality in exchange for a small service. What service? Theoden asked, though his voice suggested he already feared the answer. Information, Faramir whispered. The plans of Gondor's defenses, the movement of our armies, the secret ways into the city. Small betrayals that would save larger lives. It made sense in my pain and guilt. What was strategy weighed against the lives of innocents? The hall erupted in shocked murmurs, but Denethor's voice cut through them like a blade. And did you? Did you betray your trust for the promise of lives already lost? I considered it, Faramir said, each word seeming to tear his throat. For 3 days I lay in the houses of healing, tormented by the choice. The Nazgul's voice whispered constantly in my mind, showing me the faces of the dead, reminding me that a single word from me could have saved them all. But you did not yield, Boromir said, his voice filled with desperate hope. You could not have. I did not yield, Faramir confirmed. On the 3rd night, I rose from my bed, took a boat across the Anduin, and sought out the Nazgul Lord in his camp. I went to refuse him one final time, to tell him that I would die before I betrayed Gondor. And? Denethor's voice was barely audible. And I found that he was gone. The entire host had vanished in the night, taking their dead with them. The attack on Osgiliath had never been about taking the bridges. It had been about breaking me, about creating a weapon they could use against Gondor's heart. When I proved too stubborn to break, they simply left. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Éomer spoke. Then, where is the dishonor in this tale? You held your post, saved your men, and refused the enemy's temptation. By any measure, this was a victory. Faramir shook his head slowly. You don't understand. The Nazgul left because they no longer needed me. In those 3 days of temptation, while I wrestled with my choice, I had responded. Not with words, not with actions, but with the darker parts of my mind. I had imagined what it would be like to accept their offer, had planned how such betrayals might be carried out, and the Nazgul, who see into the hearts of men, had learned everything they needed to know. The truth of his words settled upon the assembly like a shroud. Denethor's face was stone, but his eyes burned with a terrible understanding. Within a month, Faramir continued, 3 of our strongholds had fallen to surprise attacks that struck at their exact weaknesses. Supply convoys were ambushed on routes known only to the highest commanders. A diplomatic mission to Harad was betrayed and slaughtered, destroying any hope of alliance in the south. All because the defenses I had imagined betraying proved real, and the enemy had plucked them from my thoughts like fruit from a tree. So you fled, Denethor said, his voice flat with disappointment. Rather than face the consequences of your weakness, you fled like a coward and let us believe you dead. I fled, Faramir agreed, but not to escape judgment, to prevent further harm. As long as I remained in Gondor, the Nazgul could return to my thoughts, could use me as a weapon against everything I loved. So I took the white ship they had prepared for my funeral and sailed into exile, taking with me the knowledge that could be used to harm Gondor. He straightened, squaring his shoulders as he faced his father's judgment. I have spent 7 years hunting the servants of the enemy, trying to balance the scales of my failure. The shadow creature in Rohan was spawned from the knowledge stolen from my mind, as were a dozen others I have faced. But I know now that no amount of hunting can undo what was done. No victory can restore the lives lost through my weakness. Then why return? Boromir asked quietly. Why reveal yourself now? Faramir's eyes met his brother's, and for the first time since removing his helm, something like peace flickered in their depths. Because the wheel has turned full circle, and the war that began with my failure is about to reach its end. The enemy moves openly now, and all deception is laid aside. If I am to die for my crimes, let it be in service to Gondor, rather than in exile. The great hall of the citadel fell silent as Denethor considered his son's word. Lords and knights stood like statues, afraid to breathe lest they disturb the terrible moment of judgment that hung in the air. The steward's face was carved from stone, but behind his eyes, a storm raged that few could fathom. When he spoke at last, his voice carried the weight of centuries, the authority of the Númenórean kings whose blood flowed in his veins. Faramir, son of Denethor, you stand accused not by your enemies, but by your own mouth. You confess to weakness that led to betrayal, to cowardice that led to exile, to deception that has caused your family 7 years of needless grief. Faramir bowed his head. I do confess these things, my lord steward. And yet, Denethor continued, You also confess to 7 years of service against the enemy, to victories won in darkness while your name was forgotten, to lives saved by one who had forfeited his right to be called a son of Gondor. A murmur ran through the assembly, for none had expected this turn in the steward's words. "I have ruled Gondor for 30 years," Denethor said, beginning to pace before the high seat like a caged eagle. 30 years of watching the shadow grow stronger while our strength waned. 30 years of sending other men's sons to die for decisions I have made in council chambers, far from the sound of steel on steel. He stopped before Faramir, looking down into his son's eyes. "Do you think, my son, that I have never been tempted? Do you think that in the darkest hours of the night, when defeat seems certain and hope grows thin, I have never wondered if compromise might serve better than defiance?" Faramir looked up in surprise. "Father, the Nazgul have whispered to me as well," Denethor said quietly. "In dreams, in moments of despair, in the flames of the Palantir, when I sought to read the enemy's mind and found it reading mine instead. The difference between us is not wisdom or strength. It is merely that my temptations came in private council chambers rather than on blood-soaked battlefields." Boromir stepped forward, his face troubled. "Father, surely you cannot mean—" "I mean that judgment belongs to those who have faced the same choices," Denethor interrupted. "Your brother stands before us, having walked through fire and emerged still loyal to Gondor, still willing to die in her service. How many of us can claim the same?" King Theoden, who had remained silent through this exchange, now spoke with the voice of hard-won experience. "My Lord Steward, I have ruled in Rohan for many years, and I have learned that the measure of a man is not whether he falls, but whether he rises again. This son of yours has risen, and by his own account has served the cause of good with no hope of reward or recognition. That speaks to his true character." "Well spoken," said Eowyn, stepping forward from among the assembled Rohirrim. "In Rohan, we judge a horse by how it runs when the path is hard, not by whether it stumbles in the mud. Faramir has run a hard race indeed, and crossed the finish line with honor intact." Denethor nodded slowly, then turned to address the full assembly. "7 years ago, I buried a son in grief and despair. Today, I find that son never died. He was merely transformed by trial into something stronger than what he had been before." He placed his hands upon Faramir's shoulders, and when he spoke again, his voice carried notes of warmth that had been absent for too many years. "Faramir, son of Denethor, I restore to you your name, your rank, and your place in this house. Let none say that the steward's son lacks courage or loyalty, for I have seen the proof of both in your deeds." Faramir's eyes filled with tears he had held back for 7 long years. "Father, But," Denethor continued, his voice growing stern once more, "this restoration comes with conditions. You will take your place once again as captain of the Ithilien Rangers, for that company needs strong leadership in the days to come. You will serve without reservation, without the shield of anonymity you have worn these past years, and you will never again choose exile over duty, no matter what darkness may whisper in your mind." "I swear it," Faramir said, his voice breaking with emotion. "By the memory of the fallen, by the hope of the living, I swear it." Boromir stepped forward and embraced his brother again, this time without reservation or surprise. "Welcome home," he whispered. "Welcome home, at last." But even as the assembly broke into murmurs of approval and relief, shadows were gathering beyond the walls of the White City. For the enemy had indeed been watching, and the return of Faramir, son of Denethor, had not gone unnoticed in the halls of Barad-dûr. 3 days after Faramir's restoration to his rightful place, word came to Minas Tirith that changed everything. A great host had issued forth from the Black Gate. Not raiders or advanced scouts, but the full might of Mordor unleashed at last upon the world. The mouth of Sauron had declared that the time for shadows was ended, and that all Middle-earth would now bow before the Dark Lord or burn in the fires of his wrath. In the highest tower of the citadel, The war council gathered as the sun set blood red behind the White Mountain. Maps covered every surface, marked with the positions of armies and the calculations of desperate strategists. Denethor sat at the head of the great table, his face grave with the weight of final decision, while his sons flanked him like wolves ready for battle. "The numbers are against us," Boromir said bluntly, his finger tracing the enemy's approach routes on the great map. "Even with the full strength of Rohan and our smaller allies, we are outnumbered 3-1. If we meet them in open battle on the Pelennor, we will be swept away like leaves before a storm. Then we don't meet them in open battle," Faramir replied, his voice carrying the hard-won wisdom of his years in the wild. "We make them come to us, make them pay for every stone of the city in blood and time." King Theoden studied the maps with the eye of a cavalry commander. The walls of Minas Tirith are strong, but walls have never won a war by themselves. At some point, we must strike back, and when we do, we will need every advantage we can gain. Denethor looked up from his contemplation of the southern approaches. "There is one advantage we might claim, though the price would be dear indeed." His eyes fixed upon Faramir, and in them was a pain that spoke of choices no father should be asked to make. "The Palantir," Faramir said quietly, understanding immediately. "You would have me look into the Seeing Stone and use the connection the Nazgul forged with my mind to spy upon their plan." A shocked silence fell upon the council. Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth was the first to speak. "My lord Denethor, surely you cannot mean to risk your son's mind in such a way. The Seeing Stones are perilous enough without willingly opening one's thoughts to the enemy." "The risk is mine to take," Faramir said before his father could reply. "I opened that door 7 years ago when I let the Nazgul into my thoughts. It is only fitting that I should be the one to use it against them now." Boromir slammed his fist upon the table. "No, I will not lose my brother again, not when I have just regained him. There must be another way." "What other way?" Faramir challenged. "We are outnumbered, outmatched, and running out of time. If I can learn the enemy's battle plans, discover where they mean to strike first, and with what force, we might yet find a way to victory." "And if the Nazgul seize control of your mind completely?" Eowyn asked. "If you become their weapon turned against us?" Faramir met her gaze steadily. "Then you kill me before I can do harm. It is a cleaner death than I deserve, and a more useful one than I had hoped for." The debate raged through the night, but in the end, the decision was Faramir's to make. As the dawn broke gray and cold over the Pelennor fields, he stood alone in the chamber of the Palantir, the great Seeing Stone resting upon its pedestal like a captured star. His father and brother waited outside, along with Gandalf the White, who had arrived during the night with warning of the enemy's movement. "Remember," the wizard had counseled, "you seek to look without being seen, to touch their thoughts without letting them touch yours. The moment you feel the Nazgul's influence growing strong, break the connection and flee back to your own mind." Faramir nodded and placed his hands upon the smooth surface of the Palantir. Immediately, visions flooded his consciousness: the march of vast armies, the deployment of siege engines, the dark councils where the Nazgul planned their assault. He saw the true size of the host that approached Minas Tirith, and his heart nearly failed the sight. But worse was yet to come. As he probed deeper into the enemy's plans, seeking the crucial details that might turn the tide of battle, familiar voices began to whisper in his mind. "Welcome back, son of Gondor," the Witch King hissed across the leagues. "Did you think we had forgotten you? Did you think your exile had severed the bonds we forged in your moment of weakness?" Faramir tried to pull back, but the connection held him fast. The Nazgul Lord's presence grew stronger with each passing moment, and he could feel his own thoughts being read like an open book. "Ah, such interesting plans you have made," the voice continued. "Such clever strategies to defend your White City. But we know them all now, don't we? Every secret passage, every hidden weapon, every desperate gambit your leaders have conceived." With a supreme effort of will, Faramir tore his hands from the Palantir and stumbled backward. But the damage was done. He could feel the Nazgul's laughter echoing in his mind as the truth became clear. In seeking to spy upon the enemy, he had given them everything they needed to know about Gondor's defenses. The door burst open as Gandalf, Denethor, and Boromir rushed into the chamber. They found Faramir collapsed upon the floor, his face white as parchment, and his eyes wide with horror. "What did you see?" Denethor demanded. "What did you learn?" Faramir looked up at his father with eyes full of anguish. "I saw our doom," he whispered, "and I gave it wings to fly." But even as despair settled upon the defenders of Minas Tirith, hope was riding hard from unexpected quarters. For in the darkness of his connection with the Nazgul, Faramir had glimpsed something the enemy did not expect him to see. The one weakness in their seemingly perfect plan, the single thread that, if pulled correctly, might yet unravel their victory. The price of redemption, he realized, was not always paid in blood. Sometimes it was paid in the courage to act when action seemed impossible, to trust when trust seemed folly, and to hope when hope seemed lost. As the horns of Mordor sounded in the distance and the final battle for Minas Tirith began, Faramir, son of Denethor, prepared to pay that price in full. Thus ends the tale of the masked rider of Rohan, who was revealed to be no stranger to the halls of kings, but a son of Gondor seeking redemption for failures both real and imagined. In the crucible of war, he found not the absolution he sought, but something far more precious, the understanding that true honor lies not in never falling, but in rising each time one falls, and in serving others even when one believes oneself unworthy of their trust. The great battle that followed would be remembered in song and story for all the ages to come. But that is a tale for another telling. This story ends where it began, with a rider upon the plains of Rohan, but now no longer masked, no longer hiding from the light of day, ready at last to face whatever doom or glory awaits.